Meine sehr verehrten
Ladies and gentlemen, I am as well quite delighted to be able to speak here in front of you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'd like to keep it brief because I want you to show a few pictures. Our lecture today explores the question, what becomes visible when we consider German history from outside. For the time in which I was dedicated to the early Middle Ages as a specialist, this approach is quite problematic because it does suppose an alienation of these peoples that might not have existed. Please allow me that before I would explore the question of the perception of a common history from France and Germany, I'd like to look into perception of history as such. The series, Asterix and the Goth, is quite interesting because it was published back in 1963, the same year where Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle sealed Franco-German reconciliation done via the Treaty of the Elysee. But the Goth curse with swastikas and the games they organize are staged in a way as if they would take place in the Nuremberg of the National Socialists. I don't want to dispute if this is humor, resentment, or racism. Fact is that the Germania of the antique does not have anything to do with the Goth of the late antiquity, but for perception of the past, this assimilation, Gothic equals Germanian and not the same as Roman, is quite significant. Please remember the art of the Goth that was developed in the region of Paris in the early 12th century and was then only extended decades later. This typical medieval architecture and fashion replaced Roman art. So this is architecture according to Roman art. Goth is a term that was coined in Italy during the Renaissance and was not meant to be a compliment. That the barbarians are equated with the Germans in France is shown by the elusive tablet that 4 years after the end of the Second World War was pinned to the wall of the train station close to Alesia. Goscinny and Uderzo were not the only ones having their prejudice. Let's now come to the Middle Ages in order to ask about the relationship between what divides and unites. It is quite clear that the perception of history yesterday as well as today largely depends on the context of observation, like the reception of the oeuvre of an American historian, Patrick G. Gary, about the early Middle Ages in Europe. This was a book first published in English, later in French and German, with many different titles that were quite contradictory, that were supposed to be at the expectation of the target audience. Before France and Germany is a book about the establishment and the shift or the transformation of the Merovingian Empire from a very Romanly marked empire into a not fully middle-aged empire that was quite strange to the impression of a nation. In Gary's book in French, it is said that the Merovingians would have heralded the birth of France. A few years later, the German-speaking audience was tried to appeal with this lecture with a relation to Charlemagne. This shift from the observation to the Merovingians to the Carolingians does not surprise because the empire of the Carolingians did play an important role in the history of Western Europe. So according to the country, the significance of this empire does vary. In post-war Germany, the connection between Charlemagne and Europe becomes quite obvious after having founded the Award of Charlemagne in the 1950. And then the 10th exhibition, Karl der Große, Werk und Wirkung, Charlemagne, Achievements and Legacy, held under the auspices of the Council of Europe and inaugurated as a tradition of medieval shows. The popularity peaked with 799. The interest of the renewal of the ancient period was hardly new. During the Nazi era, for example, a heated debate erupted over whether Karl was German or French. That Charlemagne was instrumentalized and abused in Nazi is shown by the plates that Hitler had bought on the anniversary of the Treaty of Verdun in 1943, 1,100 years after the division of the Empire of Charlemagne. The Führer wanted to defend this empire, and this message was not written on Meissen porcelain, but explicitly on French porcelain de Sèvres. Now about the question, Karl der Große or Charlemagne. This doesn't really make sense because it's fully anachronistic. In the early Middle Ages, we did not have neither Germany nor France. Only after the change of the century, the peoples in the East and the West had developed a different feeling of who is us. But this did not obstaculize the people in the late Middle Ages to be convinced that Charlemagne could be the King of France, but as well as the German Emperor. This consensual perception is reflected in the iconography of back then. We have numerous depictions of Charlemagne where he is shown with both coat of arms. One half of his description displayed the black imperial eagle in gold background, and the other half features of fleur de lis. Charlemagne was therefore regarded as the ideal ruler. By the High Middle Ages, his idealized image, shaped by the values of courtly culture, had taken on a momentum of its own. He became a central figure in the epic poems known as the Chansons de Geste, or one of the new heroes that were considered the ideals of knighthood in the 14th century, and he was therefore the ideal emperor. When we consider the position of Charlemagne, different aspects have to be considered that were perceived differently in France and Germany, and that I would like to show in 3 different steps. In the 3rd chapter of his biography, Charles IV explains that when he was born in 1316 as the first son of the King of Bohemia, was originally named after Wenceslaus, after the patron saint of Bohemia, but then took on the name of Charles. This name was given to him by his godfather, King Charles IV of France. He was sent for schooling there around the age of 7. Then after an interval of more than 450 years, a Roman-German emperor once again bore Charlemagne's name. The last ruler to do so, Charles the Fat, had died in 888. A look at the French royal line shows a similarly long gap. As a coincidence, the sons of Philip the Beautiful, we had a son named Charles. This name was then or became fashionous for 100 years. This trend goes back to the early 13th century, and the reason for that is a report search in the 12th century that Hugo Capet should have had before becoming king. The holy Valericus that had promised him the kingship as a compensation for the translation of his relics. Basing on this narrative, the historian Andreas von Marchien said that the marriage between Isabella von Hennegau and King Philip would be a chance that in a person of a son, the empire of the Carolingian dynasty could be recovered. Apart from that, Philip II was already of Carolingian descent because of his mother, Adela von Champagne, and it could be that Hugo Capet would be a descendant of Charlemagne by his grandmother. In the Eastern Franconia, in Germany, this dynastical question did not play a role because the elective monarchy that was actually residing in France as well did take on a more important role. This might have been the reason that the lacking consanguinity of Charlemagne in the East was not considered a flaw. In the Chronicles of Eckhard of Aarau from the late 20th century, it is shown how one knew about the different origin of the Carolingians from the Ottons and the Salians. Very important are the chronicles from Cologne from the 13th century, where the familiar relationship between the Ottons with the kings of France are underlined. Around the middle of the 13th century, Vincent from Beauvais took up the visionary report of the Holy Valericus. His narrative was then included in the Grande Chronique de France of the late Middle Ages and became the official version of French historiography. A visual example of this reunification of families is done by a miniature of the third quarter of the 15th century, where we see Charlemagne with a royal mantle, crowned with a tiara, and under the double coat of arms of the Empire and France. He is hugging a king of France that, because of his halo, is identified as Ludwig IX. 2 generations earlier, King Karl V had expressed his relationship to Charlemagne in a very special way. The king may be preparing the coronation of his son, had a stuff prepared that was supposed to show Charlemagne as a holy Karl. That this stuff was then considered a very important symbol of the power and the state, and their memory is showed by the official portrait of Napoleon as an emperor and the monument Charlemagne and his guardians on the place of Notre Dame. Since the Middle Ages, the reign of Clovis, the first king of the Merovingian dynasty, also served as a powerful source of legitimacy for the medieval French kings. They're all called Louis. So they invoked the tradition of royal anointment, which was believed to have originated during his reign. Pippin, Charlemagne's father, was the first ruler in northwestern Europe to be anointed at his coronation. This liturgical act helped to establish the concept of divine kingship. As from the 12th century, the King of France is called Christianissimus Rex, so the most Christian of all kings. And in the 15th century, the Pope called this the exclusive title of the so sacrality of the rulership is expressed differently. And under Frederick Barbarossa, the emerging imperial order was occasionally referred to as the Sacrum Romanum Imperium. So, as from the second half of the 13th century onwards, it is therefore appropriate to speak of the Holy Roman Empire, not before. The phrase of the German nation was not added until the late 15th century. A very important phase of the posthumous career was the canonization of Charlemagne in 1165 at the initiative of Frederick Barbarossa. The French kings claimed that in 1297 Louis IX was canonized by the Pope. As a result, French kings could lay claim to 2 sacred royal ancestors. We see the crucifixion. The idea was powerfully conveyed in a crucifixion painting commissioned by King Charles VII. It shows John the Baptist, St. Louis to Christ's right, and St. Dionysius, patron saint of the monarchy, and Charlemagne to his left. The 12th century saw a growing interest in Roman law coming from Italy, of course. For the King of France, it posed a threat as it could lead subjects to believe that the authority of the Roman German emperor extended into the French kingdom. In 1219, when teaching Roman law, he had this cancelled by the Pope because as the right, just as sovereign authority is one and indivisible, so is the law. Even if the danger was largely theoretical, the French king saw a need to counter it and turned to the Pope for help. The alliance of Orleans, who was a vassal of the French king. In July 1214, King Philippe II of France sieged this coalition, and very really like the emperor fled. The Battle of Bouvines ended the throne dispute between the staffers. The victory of Philip had a large resonance, not only during the lifetime of the king, but way beyond. In the late 19th century, Bouvines became a very important moment of the national history of France. The battle against the emperor became the fight against the Germans, like a tablet of the memorial to commemorate the death on the honor of the fallen during the First World War shows, where, as an exception, we cannot read 1914 until 1918, but 1214 to 1914. At this memorial, it is claimed triumphantly that the Battle on the Marne, where 1914 the French would block the way of the Germans to Paris, would be a repetition of the Battle of Bouvines. Same applies to the debate on the nationality of Charlemagne. At the same time, it does not make sense to equate the followers of the King of France or the Emperor of the French with the Germans. But a few years before the Battle of Bouvines, with the help of the Pope, the judicial separation of the King of France from the Emperor was possible all of a sudden. In November 1201, the Pope Innocent III legitimated the kids of King Philip II and the next Morania, although the Pope, the Emperor, would have been responsible to do that according to Roman law. Later on, the Pope did turn down a South French nobleman when it was about legitimating his kids. The king, who would not recognize any superior sense in worldly sense, he did not damage the rights of his own because he would not have any. This is why he could not go along. The French jurists were enforced by this. This is why the formula was thing that the King of France is ruler in his realm, and the question about the power of the king and him. Somebody said that the emperor who would have the jury would not be in the situation to use his power outside of his realm. In the same, the claim of Dietrich of Meheim that was published a position of the German history said well, we have the eagle under the or flying with other birds. It seems to be unique. This is how the Roman king and emperor has to be above all other kings. Please allow me to shed some light on the depictions of Charlemagne. Dürer depicted Charlemagne the way that the people of his time thought him to be, but this is quite an anachronistic picture. Never did Charlemagne wear the empire's crown. It was not done until the 10th or the 12th century. The crown on the staff of Carl V is quite interesting because it is a closed crown that represents the synthesis between the emperor's crown and the open crown of the kings of France. One has to be quite prudent and cautious when analyzing symbols of emperorship because the emperor has not always been depicted with this special crown, but it is quite significant that the rulers of France were only supposed to have worn a crown in the times or the era of socialism that was oriented on the imperial crown. Imperium and the emperordom were two different things. This is what the successors of the late Middle Ages of Charlemagne would know. So the claim of the King of France to be a emperor in his realm was not of political, but of real legal nature. I've talked a lot about perception of history with a relevance to Charlemagne. Around 800, a poet of the Parabon Epos said that Charlemagne would be the father of Europe. And this is something one is certain about when we give away the prize to Charlemagne. One was convinced of that in the year 2000 in Croatia, although Karl was never emperor or rey of this country. And this is a step that we can see as a claim to be accepted in the European Union. But this is therefore a deception. But when we talk about identity, then it's more important what we think than what really was there, historically speaking.